turn off disruptions, do not disturb. Okay, so I'm going to hold it up.
Okay.
All right, so I want to start with a little bit of your own story. So you're a sociologist by training. I'm curious if you can tell me if there are any foundational events or really big questions earlier in your life that led you to go into that direction to study sociology.
Well, I'm a scholar and I'm a sociologist. I guess I should back up and just say that I'm a scholar. Sociology just happened to be a field that appealed to me at the time, and for some specific reasons. But I'm a scholar mainly because I find the world that we live in utterly baffling. I'm as confused as anyone else about the changes taking place in the world, and I figure that if I can make sense of it in a serious and thoughtful way and communicate in a way that reflects a certain kind of simplicity on the far side of complexity, that it might be useful for others who are as confused as I am. So, Nietzsche and Foucault and others have long said that scholarship is a veiled form of autobiography. And for me, I would say that I have lived a life of in which I find so many things confusing, and I think that to be paid to understand and to seek truth in the midst of it is an extraordinary gift, an extraordinary blessing. It's as simple as that. Biographically, I turned 18 in 1973 during the last draft, and I had seen friends of my brother and sister go off to the Vietnam War. At this point in my life, I was had entered a place where I was reading theology, and I just could not make sense of the Vietnam War and the idea that one could kill another human being made in God's image. But it was a time where, fundamentally existential questions about the nature of life and how we treat other human beings was an everyday dilemma that I was trying to sort out. And so I applied to become a conscientious objector, and I was turned down. My father and my uncle were both in World War II, and my uncle was a spy behind the German lines. My father was in the Pacific War. And the idea that I would become a conscientious objector was not well received, let's say. But my father loved me, and we talked and argued endlessly. And at the end of the day, he wrote a letter on my appeal saying just how deeply I had been thinking about these things, that I was serious. This was not about... I was fully prepared to go to Vietnam and carry bodies off the field, but I was not prepared to lift a weapon. And I was then... I became a conscientious objector precisely because of his appeal. And it was both the moral wrestling with the issues of war that became very personal, this deeply, just profound deepening of my relationship with my father that was also profoundly loving but profoundly conflictual at the same time. And it was I think, I think my dials were set through those. Always been a kind of lifelong learner, but there was now a deeper dimension in understanding there's something at stake, and there's something that matters that we get it right. So
this is interesting that within your relationship with your father, there's a disagreement, but he also stays with you and kind of wrestles with you on this question. And just thinking about the talk earlier today about how much we feel very threatened by disagreement nowadays. We think that it's a sign that things are failing rather than, like you're saying, a problem that needs to be solved together, something we need to work through. I'm curious if you could say more about how that experience of having this fundamental disagreement but also working through it together shaped your outlook towards what we see going on in the U.S. today with, as you say, the culture war, the many big disagreements that seem to divide us rather than bring us together to problem solve.
Yeah, I think we live in a moment in which there is a kind of reduction of most issues and most people to a kind of political ontology. It's a profoundly dehumanizing take on our neighbors, on our fellow citizens, and this kind of political ontology tells us who we should take seriously and who we should not, what arguments we should take seriously, what arguments we shouldn't, and this kind of reductionism is, again, it's dehumanizing. And I think part of that formative moment in my life was so profoundly humanizing. My father and I became better because the argument was not just about an issue. It was about sort of the meaning of life and the meaning of how we as individuals who will be forgotten to history nevertheless are engaging world historical events and trying to make sense of our own lives in light of them. So I think, again, so much of our public discourse, so much of how we engage each other politically denies the complexity of human experience. It's and it trivializes, I think, the most important things. And that's even if those things are recognized, but most of them are simply ignored altogether. And I think this is part of the reason why democracy is still possible in local environments and so difficult at the national level. So
I want to talk about first, I do want to get into the kind of localist question, but I do want to talk about kind of mainstream discourse and how, you guys alluded to this during the talk, that it's kind of monopolized by these very large corporations. Mass media is concentrated into the hands of very few. I don't know, have you read at all Musa Al-Gharbi's work?
I have.
Yeah. So, he was teaching at Columbia, but he put out a book recently that...
You'll have to write it down.
I will write it down for you. No,
I do it later.
Okay, I highly recommend it. But
okay.
So he's addressing the whole phenomenon of wokeness and what's behind it. But one of the sections, he talks about this problem that, again, media is concentrated into the hands of the few, local media is deteriorating. You have very few local outlets talking about, like you're saying, these common sense issues that impact everyday people where, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you're left, right, woke, whatever. They're just everyday problems we need to resolve. And what I'm seeing, what I'm observing is that when I listen to people espouse certain political, ideological ideas, it sounds like they're regurgitating a script that they heard from one of these mainstream outlets. It's kind of algorithmic, the way that it's processed and comes out. And when you do a little more digging, you see what their real concerns are. What are the everyday problems that incline them to, pick this side? But what concerns me is that when confronted with someone on the quote-unquote wrong side, we're not really willing to do that work and say, okay, well, why do you think that? Or what do you mean when you say X, Y, and Z? Yeah. These are the bad people who are irrational, right. They're deplorable. I can't engage with them because they're too stupid or because fear of guilt by association. So, I mean, can we talk a little bit more about how this state of mainstream public discourse today, what are the factors that are making it harder for us to have real conversations?
For all the emphasis that has been placed over the last couple of generations on independent thinking in schools, there is no independent thinking. We are conformists, and I think part of it is a function of the complexity of the world that we live in. We need to simplify that complexity into markers on a map, and so we absorb pre-digested scripts. This is very much in the book, but I don't pull it out to sort of highlight the distinction. There is, of course, formal logic and a formal reasoning. And, of course, psychology has the status of a science, and it has been integrated within our public discourse as a psychologic. It is a form of reasoning that has to do with our brains and our and the pathologies of our minds and the like. I emphasize something I call cultural logics, which really are the scripts. But cultural logics are not about the truth. They're not about even an attempt at a formal reasoning. Cultural logics are mainly about meaning. And so the reason why, I've always found it funny, that the New York Times and the Washington Post spend so much time cataloging Trump's lies. They don't understand that the lies are irrelevant to his followers. It's about meaning. It doesn't matter that there was no conspiracy in a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., where children were being abused. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it fell into a cultural script, a way of thinking about the enemy, their opposition, and so social media is, again, it's not about formal reasoning, obviously, and it's not even about psychological. It's a place where cultural logics proliferate. And you see this every bit as much on the left as you do on the right? Russiagate and so on. People want to believe because they've already, in a way, made up their minds. So these cultural logics that exist as various scripts how do you talk to someone who's already sort of embedded within them these cultural logics are anchored in the deepest parts of a person because they are meaningful. They help make sense of your life. But to get there, you have to penetrate them.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I'm not sure if you can make this anonymous, that would be great, but I have a sister-in-law who is a kind of MSNBC mom, just sort of smoke coming out of her ears, right? And she's only really begun to soften up because she knows I love her, care for her, and spend time with her. And then, and it began with, okay, well, I see what you mean, and there's a concession, but it takes a lot of time and hard work to penetrate these cultural logics that are reinforced endlessly in all the media, but especially within the social media. So we are conformist. We conform to these cultural logics rather than thinking independently. And as Walter Lippmann once said, if everyone's thinking alike, no one's thinking, right?
Yeah,
no one is thinking.
Yeah, because, if you look back at the history of media studies, you see that if you look at Lippmann, if you look at Bernays,
right,
there's this intentional, there's this idea that the masses need to be controlled because they're not intelligent enough, they're too irrational. So we need to, kind of using psychology, especially Bernays as Freud's nephew, we need to kind of train them how to behave. So let's give them these simplified narratives.
That's right.
Rather than giving them actual information and letting them come to conclusions themselves.
And it's precisely what is so anti-democratic about the technocratic elite and Silicon Valley. And Lippmann was part of that in an earlier phase. He wasn't wrong in his characterization of the public, but he was condescending.
Yeah.
In ways that would never allow the public to become anything other than what it was.
But, what's interesting, though, is that as you were discussing during the talk, there is this religious dimension. We can say, yes, like we're largely secularized as a culture in terms of,
our public institutions in particular.
Yeah, but there is a religious fervor behind a lot of these positions we take on. Like you're saying, it gives meaning to say, I'm on the right side, and I'm against this other side.
And purity rituals only reinforce that kind of thing, yeah.
So, if you could say a little bit more, though, about the religious dimension behind all this. And again, we may label this as a secular society, but again, so how do we go from a society where people go to church and to synagogue to I watch MSNBC or Fox and I get my meaning from this narrative?
Well, not to get too obscure too quickly, but the distinction between Weber and Durkheim on this question is the distinction between a substantive approach to religion and a functional approach. And I alluded to this in the talk, but at a substantive level, there's no question that our public culture and our public institutions, dominated, of course, by a secular elite, have become secularized in a substantive way. But on the Durkheimian side, that doesn't mean that we're not reproducing the sacred in secular forms. And I do think that even among religious people who are beginning to emigrate out of their religious tradition, they simply replace politics for God. I've seen this just so many times. And the kind of fundamentalist fervor that you find among people who once used to be deeply committed religious believers now is simply transferred to certain political agendas and political positions. And this isn't a new thing. How many people who were who were communists became anti-communist in very religious ways, right? So I do think that we are seeing yet again something that Weber talked about, and many other political theorists as well, of the emergence of the sacred as in the form of political religion. And so substantively there is a secularization, but functionally the gods remain, and even if they change form, and they will be worshipped.
Yeah. And you said yourself in the beginning of the talk that we kind of have shifted in this Nietzschean direction, yes, where it's about power, brute power, that, we need to vote out the other side, because if they gain power, they're going to lead things in the wrong direction. So by any means necessary, we just need to vote them out. I mean, you see that kind of rhetoric dominating the last election season. What is the long-term consequence if we just approach politics as we need to vote the other side out? We got to take power away from them.
Well, look, a society that doesn't have, I use the language of e pluribus unum in the book, and any institution, whether it's a family, whether it's a church or synagogue, whether it is a place of business, a school, any institution that does not have some common culture, some common agreements, shared sensibilities about the way things should be, can't function. It simply won't work. And we are seeing that dysfunction not only at the national level, but within almost every institution of civil society, which is part of the reason why there has been a battle over the institutions of civil society. Right now, higher education is getting chastened by having become, in a way, too extreme on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, on issues of immigration, of Israel, and so on. But don't imagine for a moment that stuff's going away, right? It may be in retreat, but it's not going to disappear. I mean, look, the Democratic Party provides the political infrastructure for the class interests of the educated class right now. You can't just dismantle that by saying, oh, we need to shift to the working class and sort of hear their interests. Not going to work. These things are deeply embedded within the structures of late modern society, and it's just hard to imagine them being changed anytime soon.
And you alluded to the potential of the local. The fact that, there's a certain level of agency we have to make change when we're doing it at a more simple level. But then there's this other issue of, our lifestyle and our priorities. A lot of people work very arduous, demanding jobs. They want to go home, just relax, watch TV with their family, rather than go to, some kind of local association meeting or something at the parish. To volunteer, start some kind of whatever organization. I'm curious for you, since, you're saying that you think this is something hopeful, while still being aware of all the obstacles within our kind of modern economy, our modern lifestyle. What do you do? What ways do you stay involved and actually try to engage that on that local level?
I'm not the right person to ask.
Okay.
No,
If not you, what do you think people should start looking at?
And the reason there's such a... Well, let me respond to this seriously. Volunteerism works if there's a pretty strong line between the vocational and the avocational, between the world of work and the world of home and private life and so on. And those spheres are so blended for me. I am working, I'm in my late 60s now, and I'm still working 80-hour weeks. And it's all woven together because the way I think is there's a need for it for people who are looking for wisdom or context in the world of education or in the world of faith or churches and so on. So I do an awful lot of public speaking that I think serves these civic ends, but it all kind of feels like work to me.
That's something. Not nothing.
No, I don't. I think it's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think it's nothing. I think it is something, but but it feels so integrated with everything else that I do. Because I think, again, most people are as confused as I am. And if I produce a book and it seems to be useful, I get interviewed, so is this work or is this civic duty,
Yeah.
What are we doing here? Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me that this all goes back to that first question you had when you were younger, trying to make sense of what's going on here. That your kind of faithfulness to that question opens the door to all these things, all these books, these initiatives, these discussions that, are in service of the common good.
That's right.
Yeah. So, the one thing I am curious, though, because a lot of people here are involved in religious communities and parishes, and I feel like there is a lot of potential for civic engagement within religious communities, but perhaps, I don't know, I'm wondering if you have advice for people, like how can we use religious communities, houses of worship, to have these discussions, to get involved in responding to local needs, solving problems on that smaller level.
So I wrote a book. My apologies. It was called To Change the World. And the subtitle was The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World. And in the book is divided into 3 essays, and the first essay has 7 chapters, and it addresses Christianity and world changing. Sort of what are the dynamics of world changing? The second essay is on power, because to change the world is to influence it, and to influence is at some level to wield some power. So how do Christians view power these days? And I looked at the political theologies of the Christian right, left, and the kind of quietistic, what I call the neo-Anabaptist, but there's a Catholic dimension of this as well that's kind of withdrawn from the world, more monastic in some respects. What is the political theology and how does it engage or think about power? And certainly within Protestantism, it's all about this kind of Nietzschean turn, right? And the third essay is called Toward a New City Commons, and it's an argument that the political theologies, left, right, and neo-Anabaptist, were simply the political edge of 3 major paradigms by which Christians engage the late modern world. And I call those defensive against, relevance to, and purity from. Right? Defensive against the world, therefore you got to fight it. Relevance to, which means you simply assimilate. And then purity from, which means you withdraw from it. And I unpack all of that theologically and sociologically and culturally, and in the midst of all of that, I offer a 4th paradigm called faithful presence within. And, it's a story of Jeremiah, where Israel is now exiled into Babylon. And God speaks to Jeremiah and says, seek the welfare of the city that you're in, right? Get married, raise kids, establish homes, and so on. Pray for the inhabitants of the city, because in their flourishing, you will find your flourishing, right? So I argue for a completely different political theology. I think, and a very different paradigm for engaging the world. Right now, the integralist would be sort of the Catholic. There's also a Protestant version of that that's more defensive against, right? It's also, has some very prominent illiberal dimensions to it. But in any case, so much of liberal theology is simply assimilated. It's not even recognizably Christian in many respects. And sort of the purity from, I think people are just exhausted. The idea of faithful presence within, unfortunately, it was read too individualistically. The theory that I lay out is that it's about the church. It is about the institutions. So if we are physicians, nurses, we are in the healthcare world, we who are believers find common cause to be faithfully present. Okay? And this is to operate in every sphere. What does it mean to be faithfully present? We take our model from the incarnation. We didn't seek God out. God sought us out. What did he do? He emptied himself on our behalf and for our flourishing. And how did he do this? Through acts of love. This is the model of faithful presence. We first return that to God, right? But then also to our neighbor. We seek out our neighbor. We empty ourselves on behalf of their flourishing through acts of love. We finally do this in our vocation, because we can worship God in our vocation. We empty ourselves in acts of love, so that works of scholarship are in fact acts of scholarship are actually acts of worship. Acts of writing, communicating, popularizing are acts of worship. But we do this out of love for God and love for our neighbor. But there's an individual but also institutional component. That's what it means. We seek the welfare of the city that's around us. We seek the welfare of the people who are our ideological enemies. Right? So...
Yeah. No, I mean, but now I want to bring this back to, again, the big question of what's going on here in this world where everything doesn't seem to make any sense. I mean, at this point in your life, what would you say does give you hope? Even though, yes, things are pretty wild and outlandish today, is there something that you hold on to?
Well, first of all, I think despair is a sin. So I would draw that boundary pretty sharply, okay? I also take hope in the fact that the social sciences have been terrible about predicting anything. If there were sociologists who lived in the early decades of the 16th century, they would have never predicted the Protestant Reformation. I'm sure of that. So I don't think that sociology or the social sciences broadly, a lot can happen, and we don't know. But I also find some hope. In that I believe that most Americans, most people, still operate out of a reservoir of goodwill. They're not articulate about it. They stutter over it, but you can find kindness and benevolence. Not everywhere. for sure, but there is a reservoir of goodwill, but it does need to be drawn out. And to me, I would say this as a Christian believer, that we live in a moment in which the church can become the church again. And by that I mean we can give up the pretensions of having to defend the empire and simply be the church again. And I don't mean that in a kind of way that sort of withdraws from the world, but retains its historic identity as the people of God, but nevertheless goes out into the world to serve in a way to become the broken body of Christ on behalf of a broken world. Now, I'm speaking very theologically and not sociologically, but when I speak of hope, I have to speak that way. That's where those are where my deepest convictions are, so.
And I think, an event like this is an example, because it's, sharing this question, which is coming from a place of faith, sharing questions about our society, about the world today, inviting everyone to participate, to kind of be on that journey together. So, I would agree with you that, to give in to despair, it is a sin, because we still have the agency, the capacity to seek hope, but also we won't be fulfilled if we live in despair. Sure. So it's, no, thank you for this. This was, I'm happy that we could dig a little deeper into some of the things you said.
Well, your questions were great, Stephen.
Thank you.
Great seeing you again.
You too.
Okay, cheers.
All right. We're good?
I got this.